how am I going to start this thing off?
This is probably the worst topic I've ever encountered.
What?
I mean, I would say like this is literally the worst topic I've ever seen in PF, and I've been around it for 8 years.
Seriously?
I think so. I mean, you tell me one that's worse. This one is so tilted.
I know. Word.
Or in our former debate, I would strike this topic.
I would totally strike. I would strike it like. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Hail State Debate. It is February, which means it is the traditional time of year to do our annual NSDA economics-based topic. It's the topic that you either really love because you're kind of an economics nerd like me, you think that's great, or you really hate.
Which is where I fall.
And I'm going to be totally honest with you folks, it's really where I fall on this as well. I don't mean to be a downer, but it is a bit of a challenging topic. It is resolved the United States should replace means-tested welfare programs with a universal basic income. We're going to do a deep dive into it today, try to walk you through some useful arguments, some theory, and some explaining of definitions and stuff. As always, we want this to be useful to you. So if it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. We are on Twitter, as always, at Hail State Debate if you kind of want our general thoughts on topics and stuff like that. And as always, of course, the links and the timestamps will be in the notes below, so you can find all of that stuff. We do love to respond to comments, so if you have questions, feel free to do that, and we'll try to be as helpful as possible, because again, we just want this to be something that everybody across the country can use, whether you've got a big program, a small program, whether you're on your own or whatever. So, as always, you kind of already spoiled this a little bit, but like rating the topic on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you put it?
I'd give it a 2.
Oh gosh,
yeah.
Wow.
Well, there's so little
Wow.
on the pro side. I mean, we were talking before we came in here, and basically we're going to have to run some Hail Marys for you guys on affirmative and hope that somebody buys it. So a lot of this is going to be saying something a little outlandish with a smile on your face like you believe what you're saying.
To be fair, I will say, I think some of the stuff we're going to get into about the problems that the pro has will be a little more advanced than some of the teams you may hit will have. And so on some of these rounds, you'll have folks who won't pick up on some of these problems, and you can actually run, I think, some pretty good sort of standard arguments about like why UBIs are sort of generically good as opposed to why replacing means-tested welfare. Like the less the con emphasizes the replacement part, the stronger the pro becomes. Right. But I agree, I think in really strong rounds between strong debaters, I just think the pro has a major uphill battle. I'd probably put it more like a 4.5 or a 5, but I think, yeah, it's not the greatest topic they've ever done. So actually that leads into my first sort of generic thought on the resolution. We're going to do our opening thoughts here, so that's what we do. And then after the opening thoughts, we'll do a little bit of background and framework, and then we'll do the pro and then the con, as always. So my first opening thought on this is that I love the topic area, but I'm just not super crazy about the wording of the topic. I think the NSD's, the general topic area of a universal basic income, what are we going to do about income inequality, what are we going to do about like automation and things like that is a necessary topic. But the problem is, as we'll keep coming back to again and again, the phrase replace means-tested welfare programs, I think locks the pro into a very specific version, or at least arguably, right? Arguably locks the pro into a very specific, somewhat disadvantageous version of the UBI that is harder to defend. There are ways to try to get around it, but they require time and effort that are scarce commodities in PF debate. If it were up to me, I probably would have had a resolution that says something more generic, like the United States should just adopt a UBI, leave it at that, and let debaters kind of have fun with what that means and how we're going to advocate for that. But we didn't. We have replacing means-tested welfare, and so that's what we're going to run with.
Yeah, and one thing you need to keep in mind with a topic like this is we are talking about a very controversial program in welfare, and a program that leaves people kind of vulnerable. So what we'll be doing here is we need to be really respectful when we deal with topics. Like we'll be talking about people who are impoverished. We'll be talking about people of color. So naturally, be respectful when you do that. Less advantaged or low income is preferable to poor.
Yeah, you just have to be really careful, I think, on, for example, even the word welfare, right, is historically fraught. It has been used as a pejorative. It's in the resolution, though, so you might think in terms of saying, you know, welfare programs as opposed to just calling it welfare. Obviously, we're going to have to refer to poor people, but poor people is better than the poor. And you just have to remember, judges come from all different backgrounds, and we just want to be super respectful to folks who, you know, frankly, a lot of you guys, you know, debaters, you come from comfortable backgrounds, and you need to be very respectful and thoughtful. My last big thought on this is, on any economics topic, like for example, when we did the budget deficit last year, it is imperative that you work on turning all those random data points into a story, right? And we're going to talk later about turning these sort of isolated points into a story. That's really what economics is at the end of the day. So for example, when you're on the con, being able to say the money we're going to get from doing away with means-tested welfare is not enough to create a viable universal basic income. All we're going to be doing is giving rich people vacation money, right, while the poor have to make do on much, much less, right? That kind of explanation is what you need to be talking about, not just reading, you know, numbers and charts and graphs to the judge. So,
yeah, and on that point, on the pro, if you don't have as much substantive argumentation to provide as the negative, which you won't, regardless of how good your case is, one thing to do might be opening your speech with some kind of anecdote about a person who is currently excluded from welfare or not getting by on welfare, and talking about how the limitations that are placed on those people hurt them. Like any kind of pathos you can bring forward here would be very helpful.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that later, about how while this will be primarily an economic topic, there's some opportunities to kind of vary it up and have some sort of human interest and more subjective impacts on things like just quality of life, racial equality, gender equality, things like that. Any chance you get to do that, I wouldn't run my whole case based on, but any chance you have to do that, I think is a good idea. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to move on and give a little bit of historical background, define some terms, and just kind of define the overall framework of the resolution, and then we'll move on and do some pro arguments, and then we'll do the con arguments. So in terms of framing the resolution, I want to try something a little bit different in this case, in the interest of both time and efficiency, but also I think it's kind of the best way to tell the story, which is I would like to walk through a little bit of the history of the topic and then kind of do definitions as we go, because I know we typically don't read a lot of definitions in PF debate in many cases. Some do, some don't, but it's still important to know what they are to have a framing mechanism, but it's also important to have historical background, right? So the way I would start is this. I would say that most of you guys are probably referring to this as the UBI topic. Like when you refer to it, you call it UBI. Like your files probably have UBI on the names of them, right? But I would say this is really at least as much, if not more, the means-tested welfare topic, because there is an actual history, a long history, a fraught history of means-tested welfare programs in the United States, and I think you need to understand a little bit about that to be able to tell the story in this round. So looking back over a long term, at the state and local level, welfare programs in the United States actually predate the founding of the country. Like even in the colonies, you would have policies like publicly funded pensions for widows and disabled veterans and things like that. But to be fair, the first term in the resolution is the United States. And normally, unless we're dealing with really squirrely people, when we talk about a United States resolution, we're talking about the United States federal government. The vast majority of welfare benefits that are means tested in the United States today are at least in partly linked to the federal government. So I think that the vast majority of cases are going to be linked to that, and that's what we're going to use for the majority of the video. Now, to be fair, if you were to bring in a few state level benefits, I don't think that would fundamentally change the calculus. I think it would change the specific numbers a little bit, but I don't think it would dramatically change the debate. So I think it's safe for us to just go with United States federal government. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Okay, fair enough. So with that, since we're doing United States federal government, where does the United States federal welfare system come from? Well, it begins in earnest back during the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal, which is the source of so many economic policies, and the Social Security Act. And so in addition to creating the Social Security system, which may or may not be means tested, many people would say it's not, right? Well, so we'll lay that aside. But in addition to that program that it's named for, the Social Security Act produced a lot of means tested benefits, right? It created welfare payment programs for needy children, for the disabled, for the blind, right? In the 1970s, under President Johnson's Great Society programs, we saw some of these expand. We saw things like food stamps and nutrition expenditures expand. And historically, as you can see from some of these charts that we're going to pop up, there have been dramatic increases in overall welfare spending on the federal level, up from, you know, a handful of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to trillions of dollars today, right? And these are all, again, what we call means-tested welfare programs. So now I think we should pause and be very precise about what that actually means. So a very common kind of academic definition of means-tested welfare programs comes from Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation in 2012, and he says that what we're talking about is 79 federal programs providing cash, food, housing, medical care, social services, and so on for poor and low-income people. And he says they have several characteristics, right? He says, first of all, they provide aid solely on the basis of, well, solely to people with low incomes, right? So that's what means tested means, right? Your means, your ability to pay, your income, your resources, right? That's the test. You have to be low income, right? Secondly, he says that these benefits are not based on prior contributions. So unlike Social Security, where you pay in every year throughout your working life and then you draw the benefits out when you retire, and unlike certain other federal benefits programs, you're not paying in for these things. Now, this is a little controversial. We're going to talk about in just a second whether that's actually the case, but this is sort of a commonly accepted definition. It's based on how much you earn, your eligibility, and you don't pay in to become eligible for it. Now, to be fair, there is a definitional fight to be had here. So, for example, Rector says specifically in his definition that Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance are not forms of means-tested welfare, right? However, there are arguments, for example, Merrill Matthews in Forbes of 2015 argues that in fact today, after 2015, Medicare actually has become somewhat of a means-tested program because people with higher incomes now pay higher premiums for certain optional parts of Medicare. Now, this can get incredibly complicated in the scope of a PF round, but just be aware there could be arguments about whether Medicare or even Social Security is means-tested. I mean, I think you had some information suggesting there are people who say that Social Security could be means-tested.
I'm going to drop a link to an article that really describes how Social Security, because your benefit is prorated, where you get less of what you paid in back the more you have in income, that I'm going to argue basically that is means tested because it's a progressive system. That is, the wealthier you are, the less you ultimately get back.
Right, so traditionally most people would say that Medicare and Social Security, which again cost billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars every year, are not going to be means tested welfare programs, and we're not going to be getting rid of them. But what we're pointing out here is that if you're really kind of a stickler for what means tested means, right, the more your income affects how much you get, you might be able to make that argument, and that could change dramatically the cost-benefit analysis of how the round goes. So it's just important to be aware of those things. For most of this video, we are going to focus on the things that pretty much everybody agrees are means-tested welfare programs. Just be aware that there could be people who kind of try to squirrel that, and it actually might be important because it could give the pro more money to play with later on to have a higher universal basic income. But returning to the things that pretty much everybody agrees are means-tested welfare programs, you can find a definition, for example, from the Congressional Budget Office in 2017 actually did a really good study of the cost of means-tested welfare programs, and of course we're going to link to that. But some examples, and it's important to know what these are, right, to be able to talk about them, particularly when you're on the con, right? As the con, you need to be very articulate about exactly what benefits we're giving up, how they work, and how people are going to suffer when they go away, right? So for example, the big one, the one that results in more than half of the expenditures on means-tested welfare in this country would be Medicaid, right? Medicaid is health insurance coverage for individuals and families that are in poverty, and it is more than half of what we spend on all means-tested welfare. And as we're going to talk about later, taking away this health coverage for poor people and replacing it with a monthly payment, that would have to be some kind of a monthly payment in order to just make up for Medicaid alone, which is sort of the beginning of where the pros' problems come from on this, right? Beyond that, there are also health insurance subsidies that go beyond Medicaid. These are subsidies to help people that are making too much for Medicaid but still not a large amount afford private health insurance. There's the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, which is health coverage for children in Medicaid ineligible families, but they're still low income, like to make sure the kids have insurance. There's a SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and many other related nutritional assistance programs like subsidized school lunches and breakfast. These are things to make sure people have this used to be called called food stamps, and in some cases it is still colloquially called food stamps, right? Because they would hand you like stamps to go buy food with at the grocery store. But these are programs focused on nutrition for low-income folks, right? There are also things like earned income and child tax credits. These are a little more controversial, but most people would say they're means tested because they're giving a tax break to folks who make enough money to pay income taxes but still are in the lower income range. Because you can make up to $55,000 a year, even a little more, and get an earned income tax credit. But as some of you guys know or may know, if those of you who live maybe in like New York, DC, San Francisco area, $55,000 a year for a family does not go very far in those areas. And so these folks get a bit of a tax break to make ends meet. That would be the earned income and child tax credit. The other big one, and one of the oldest ones, would be supplemental security income, which is commonly known as disability benefits. These are payments to disabled individuals who have shown that they are unable to work if they are below a certain income level. Like if they have just residual income from investments, they don't get it. So it is like means tested. There's Pell Grants. Low-income folks going to college or going to vocational school can be eligible for Pell Grants to pay for their tuition. And then finally, veterans' pensions are actually means tested. You don't get a veteran's pension if you're an enlisted person in the U.S. military just because you reach a certain age. You actually have to show that you're below a certain income level, and if you're above that, then you don't get it or you get it phased out, right? So that's a short list of some of the things that you would be looking at doing away with. And as the con, I think you just have to be very, very articulate about here's exactly what we're giving up, right? I think the next question you're going to ask is how much money are we talking about, spending on these things? Because the amount of money that we spend on means-tested welfare programs, at least arguably, is going to directly define the amount of money that we have to play with to create this UBI. Now we're going to try to get out from under that, right?
Which I will talk about in the pro speech.
We absolutely have to try to get out from under that as the pro. We have we have options. The other option is to lose, right? But we have to try. But the con is going to say, and the conventional wisdom would be that if we're going to say the word replace, which we'll talk about in a minute, then the amount of money we have to do a UBI is going to come from the amount of money we get rid of from means-tested welfare. Well, how much is that? Well, according to the CBO, and by the way, Congressional Budget Office, gold standard credible source in terms of government numbers, so this is very good, but CBO in 2017 gives us this nice 10-year running estimate for what means-tested welfare programs cost. It's very handy, and it tells us that right now in 2020, we should be at about $845 billion a year, and we'll be up to $1.13 trillion by 2027. So look, for convenience sake, for the rest of this video, we're at $845 billion right now. In a couple of years, we're going to be at about $1 trillion. So I'm just going to, for convenience sake, say that right now, the best estimate is we're probably spending something around $1 trillion on things we can all agree are means-tested welfare programs. Now, in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about how, for example, Social Security and Medicare could dramatically change that calculus. But the things that we all agree are means-tested welfare are about $1 trillion. How much is that, right? Well, it would be about a little less than 1/5 of the entire federal budget. Right? So the entire federal budget is $4.74 trillion. It's a little more than all of what we spend on the military budget, which is $700 billion. And it's a little bit less than our total budget deficit. We have a budget deficit that we have to borrow every year of about $1 trillion. So we're talking about a big old chunk of money here. But is it enough to give a substantial UBI? Put a pin in that. We'll come back to it, right? So back to the historical story. Remember, we stopped back in the 1970s. We were expanding these programs. We've just now finished talking about how big they've gotten, $1 trillion. But let's rewind time back to the 1970s. So we get to the 1980s, and who gets elected but good old Ronald Reagan? A hero to my parents. Are your parents big Reagan?
Big Reagan fans.
Most people's parents, unless they are avowed left-wingers or liberals or whatever, like progressives, are big Reagan fans, at least in their generation, I have found. But at any rate, in the 1980s, you have this new wave of free market conservatism, like peace, love, and understanding goes out the window, greed is good becomes like the new thing. And in that environment, means-tested welfare programs became a popular target for scapegoating. So Ronald Reagan comes along, and he is well known for telling stories of these so-called welfare queens. And these are women who are allegedly living luxurious lifestyles on federal welfare payments. Now, to be clear, these stories were badly, badly misleading. The handful of people who did this were criminals who were defrauding the government and went to jail for it. They were not law-abiding welfare recipients, but that didn't stop people, right? The stereotype stuck. And to be perfectly clear, the specific women that Reagan was pointing to in these stories were overwhelmingly African American. Welfare queen became a sort of pseudo-racial epithet, an epithet against the poor. It was a racist dog whistle in many ways. I don't like to accuse people of that casually, but it clearly became that, right? And that's a subject we'll come back to later. But welfare programs, particularly means-tested welfare programs, became a convenient target for scapegoating for people who wanted to blame the poor, blame minorities and other things for the country's economic problems, right? And so in 1994, you've got the Republican Congress under Newt Gingrich, right? Super arch-conservative, and you've got a centrist Democrat president in Bill Clinton. And welfare is still a very popular target. Poor people still a convenient scapegoat. They don't vote in the same numbers as, as middle class and wealthier people. They don't have as much influence. So the Republicans come up with this thing called the Contract with America, and a big part of it is what's called welfare reform. They are promising to end welfare as we know it, right? And they pass, with Clinton's signature, something called Personal Responsibility and Work Reconciliation Act, better known as welfare reform. And what this does is it gets rid of the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which was the big welfare program before that, and replaces it with something called TANF, right? And TANF is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, right? And the big difference between AFDC and TANF is that TANF is a block grant program. You are not entitled to necessarily get any money under TANF. We give block grants to the states, right? And they can do whatever they want with it, right? So TANF ends up getting diverted. Like, states use TANF for things that don't directly go toward poor people. They use it for pre-K programs. They use it for tax credits. They use it for things that don't directly assist the very poor. And this is going to be important later on the Pro when we talk about how a lot of welfare benefits actually, under the status quo, a lot of means-tested welfare programs under the current TANF system and other programs, right? Because of welfare reform and because of changes to the policy, they actually don't make their way to the people who need them. And many people who are supposed to be getting them don't get them, so a universal system might be better. And it's just important to understand that. So we get through the 90s, right? And now we've made it to the 21st century, and people are still looking for ways to quote unquote fix the welfare system, right? Because to be fair, right, there are structural problems with it. For example, if a means-tested welfare program by definition has to have a cap on how much you can earn, or a phase-out, right? And the phase-out means the more you earn, you may get to a point where you're a single working mom, and every additional dollar that you earn at your job, at some margin, results in you losing benefits that you would have gotten. And it has to be that way. There's no way around it, right? That's sort of definitional. And so you kind of have this valley, this gap between poverty and like middle-class status, where as you cross that valley, you don't really make any progress until you get all the way across it, right? Because you're losing benefits for every dollar of income you gain. And the argument is this is a disincentive to try to increase your income and to work harder and to be more productive, right? And we'll talk more about that later, right? So the clever solution, because the 21st century, it's the time for very clever people, tech people, think tanks and things like that to come up with clever solutions, right? The clever solution to that, ironically, is the universal basic income. So let's talk about what a universal basic income is and why people think it might be a solution to the problems of welfare. So what is the basic definition of a UBI? Okay, so according to Heller in the New Yorker, and a really good July 2018 article we'll link to, a UBI is a fixed income that every adult, rich or poor, working or idle, automatically receives from the government. Unlike today's means-tested or earned benefits, they're usually the same size, they arrive without request, right? This is a good working definition. It's the same for everybody. There's no eligibility requirements other than maybe age, right? It doesn't get phased out. Investopedia actually has a good plain language definition that will pop up on the screen. It's unconditional. There's no means testing. There's no strings attached. It's paid in cash, right? They don't go and give you things like food or pay your rent and things like that. One quick thing to remember on the definition of UBI, don't get it confused with a guaranteed minimum income or a GMI. A GMI is where the government sets a level that you have to make, and whatever your income is, they will bump that up by that amount. So if the GMI is $20,000 and you make $16,000, they'll give you $4,000 to make it up. That would not be a universal basic income, because if you make more than the GMI, you get nothing, right? There is no universal payment there. So be careful as you're reading literature. Some sometimes people use those terms somewhat interchangeably, and you want to be careful and not, conflate one with the other. I think that's really important. Now, if you want to be a little clever in terms of how you define a universal basic income, if you want to give yourself a little more leeway, there is an IMF definition of UBI. Universal basic income is an income support mechanism typically intended to reach all or a very large portion of the population with no or minimal conditions. So later on, we're going to talk about why in the world would we want to have a welfare program that gives $10,000 a month to Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. And I guess if you wanted to carve out a tiny number of the super rich, right, to avoid that, maybe you could use the IMF definition. IMF is usually pretty credible, and you could sort of carve that out there, right? But however you define a UBI specifically, for a long time it was seen as kind of this progressive far left idea that was almost seen as kind of utopian, like you weren't going to find any libertarians or conservatives who agree with it. But over the last 15 or so years, it's kind of begun to catch on with some conservative folks, including supply-side economists and libertarians, and the reason is the word replace, right? And that is the essential part of this resolution. Webster defines replace as to put something new in the place of, Cambridge to take the place of something, right? And this was a key part of why conservatives and libertarians started, at least a few of them, started to form this strange coalition with progressives on the idea of a UBI. In 2006, conservative political scientist Charles Murray of the American Enterprise Institute wrote a book called In Our Hands, A Plan to Replace the Welfare State, right? And this was where he articulated the conservative case for getting rid of means-tested welfare and replacing it with a UBI. Now let me be clear, Murray is a super, super controversial figure because he also wrote a book called The Bell Curve, right, which is a book that has racial implications about IQ levels, and he gets protested when he goes to campus. I would not cite Murray in a round. It's not a good idea, but he was the sort of bell cow, if you will, for conservatives and libertarians saying, hey, maybe we can compromise here. Maybe you progressives can have something you want in a universal basic income, and we can have something we want by getting rid of these means-tested welfare programs, right? So Murray actually called for abolishing all federal welfare programs, not just means-tested ones, but also Social Security and Medicare, and giving every American over 21 a $10,000 a year UBI. And that's how this odd alliance and this movement to replace means-tested welfare with a UBI got started. And what you need to understand, and this is why the resolution is so limiting, I think, and why we both have such a problem with it, is replacing means-tested welfare with a UBI is fundamentally different than a UBI that is stacked on top of existing welfare programs, like a new tax-funded UBI through a VAT tax or an income tax. A new tax-funded UBI would almost certainly be a major boon to all poor and working class people, right? Because they're going to pay less in taxes, right? And the downside would be how are we going to pay for it? But a UBI that's funded by abolishing welfare and replacing it doesn't do that, right? You don't have, at least in theory, you don't have new expenditures. The whole idea is we're going to get rid of an existing expenditure, an existing benefit, and replace it with a different one, right? And so then you get to the question, and this is a very, very important question, and I know this segment's gone on for a while, but under this idea of replacing means-tested welfare, if that's how we're going to do it, if we're going to take the existing amount and replace it, how much is this UBI going to be? And this is where the math part of the video starts, but it's really, really important, right? So if we take the consensus idea that everybody accepts these means-tested welfare programs are worth or cost about $1 trillion a year, and we're going to get rid of those and replace them, what kind of a UBI could that trillion or so dollars a year get us? Well, if you look to the Census Bureau for 2019, it tells us that we have 328 million Americans with 22.4%, or 73 million being under 18, which leaves us with a ballpark of about 254 million adults over the age of 18, right? So if we divide $1 trillion by 254 million adults who would be eligible for this over 18, what we get is $3,937 per person. That's what your UBI would be if, and of course, can you play with these numbers? Can you look at different estimates more or less? Yeah, but it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of that if we just took our universally, things we all accept are means-tested welfare and we use that. We'd be looking at something in the neighborhood of $4,000 a year. Now, there are other estimates, Like, for example, James Hughes of the Journal of Evolution and Technology in 2014 suggests that if we did it, we could get $5,000 per adult American, but he includes Social Security, right? So that's, generally not considered a means-tested welfare program. But the bottom line is, right, the amount of money that we're going to be talking about per person is probably somewhere in the neighborhood between a little less than $4,000 and $5,000 a year. So what is that going to get you, right? Well, it depends on who you are. So like, I'm a lawyer and my wife's a teacher, right? So if we each get $4,000 a year, that's $8,000, right? So for us, we've already got food, we've got a house, we've got health insurance. So for us, we might build a new deck with that. We might go on a vacation with that, right? Something along, what would you do with $8,000 a year, just totally free and clear?
Gosh, a lot of traveling.
Yeah, like a lot of traveling. If you're fortunate enough that you have the stuff you need, you would be able to do that, and that's great. But here's the question: what are we giving up so that I can have a new deck or a trip to Disney World? Well, we're giving up Medicaid, right, which is health insurance for the poor. We're giving up SNAP. We're giving up nutrition programs, disability benefits, Pell Grants, earned income tax credits. Now you say, these folks, well, don't worry. These folks are going to get, $4,000 a piece a year. But as we're going to show later on the con side, that $4,000 a piece a year is really arguably not even enough to pay for basic health insurance, right? It's not even going to get you your Medicaid benefits back, much less a lot of these other things. And this is where, like, we run into a lot of the problems that the pro has. Just mathematically, if all you're doing is taking the funding of means-tested welfare, you're going to have a benefit that is so low that it cannot possibly make up for the benefits that the extremely poor, the disabled, people who are really sick and need a lot of help from health insurance are going to have, right?
Which is why we need to talk real quick about fiat power.
Yes.
Basically, on the pro, you're going to argue that you don't have to just get the money from replacing the other programs. You're going to argue you can get it from wherever you want to. So from increasing taxes, any other source of revenue. You don't have to give one. And in fact, I wouldn't give a specific plan because it's against the rules. But you do need to establish that you have the power to make it happen. And you can do that by an analogy, a similar program, or just hopefully finding an opponent who doesn't know what that means.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely imperative that for the pro, unless you're just willing to try to live with the idea of a very small UBI and taking away larger benefits, which we're going to talk about what those numbers look like later, you're going to have to try to find a way to say, when we say replace, we are entitled to, we can still spend more on the UBI than just the amount we're spending right now, right? Well, that does raise, though, some thorny questions. First of all, would that be a plan, right? As we all know, in public forum debate, you're not supposed to use plans, but you can use what's called a common sense solution, right? There's another question of whether this would be what we call extra topical. Extra topicality would be a situation where the resolution says we do X, and then you, as the affirmative or the pro, pile something else on top of that. Like if the resolution says we should have a flat tax, and then you say we're advocating for having a flat tax and spending it on stopping climate change. Well, the climate change part is extra topical, right? So you're going to have to make an argument that you as the pro, number one, are not running a plan, and number two, that you have a right under the word replace to consider the possibility of spending additional money, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in a really, really difficult spot, right? And another thing that Con could argue is like, look, when the word replace is used, that is referring us to a very specific theory of how UBIs work. The resolution is directing us to basically Charles Murray's book, where we take the amount of money we're saving and spend only that. And you could sort of make an intent of the drafters argument that they intended you to not spend more money. So I think the pro is going to have a bit of an uphill battle, and we'll talk about why they can't, I think, do it in just a second. But the pro has a bit of an uphill battle to try to argue that it has some leeway to do more than just take this $1 trillion or whatever, because as we're going to see in a little while, that's just not going to be a sufficient amount to meet the needs of the people who are going to be sort of thrown off of the system, right?
And while we're on that, like one of the analogies that you could use is I'm using a 2011 refurbished MacBook Pro. So if I were going to replace it with a brand new MacBook Pro, even if I sold this one, I would absolutely have to provide supplemental money to get the new one. You can make the same argument with cars, or if I replaced my apartment with an actual freestanding single-person home.
Which you hope to do one day.
Which I hope to do one day. Any of those three analogies would work. Or if I want to replace my dinner plans at McDonald's with getting a steak.
So yeah, why don't we just talk about that now? I think the pro does have to take a stab at being able to have more freedom to spend more money. So for example, I think Alicia's point is very, very good, which is the idea that we're going to spend more money does not contradict the word replace. If I sell my Toyota Highlander and take the money from that and go buy a Ferrari, I'm going to have to get more money to buy the Ferrari, but the Ferrari still clearly replaced it. It has the same function. It is my vehicle, right? So I think the pro can argue that you do have some leeway. Another thing you can look at as the pro, if you want to have more leeway to spend additional money, would be the phrase common sense solutions in the PF rules. Remember, PF rules say no plans, but you can have, quote, common sense solutions. And so, for example, Andrew Yang's freedom dividend, I don't think that, I would certainly not run that as a plan because it has problems with it. It has, for example, the ability to keep your welfare benefits. But one thing Andrew Yang does say in this widely publicized plan is we're going to throw a 10% VAT tax on top of the amount we were spending on these old programs, right? And you could say, I don't have the ability to advocate for a plan. I'm not advocating for a plan, but if you just look to the real world, there are plenty of realistic proposals that supplement the replacement of welfare with an additional source of revenue, and you as the judge can fiat that, just like if you fiated replacing the Toyota with the Ferrari, you would necessarily have to come up with some money. There's no rules violation there. But I think there's going to be sort of a debate theory fight there, and I believe that the pro has to be ready to have it and to say, no, we have the ability to spend more money in order to do this. One last thing on sort of the framing of the resolution before we move on to the pro is the fact that by limiting the debate to a situation where we are replacing welfare benefits, unfortunately, I think NSDA has dramatically limited our ability to use a lot of really great evidence on the pro side, really on both sides, but mainly on the pro, which is to say that, for example, you have examples from Alaska and Finland and Kenya and Appalachia and all these sort of small pilot programs that we'll talk about later. But one of the things, if I'm the con, that I'm going to be asking in every single case, if you're reading me those studies, is, okay, in that study and with that evidence, did they take away any benefits and replace them? No? Well, then it's basically irrelevant because there's no trade-off, right? This whole resolution is about a trade-off, right? And so if you're going to read me evidence that says in Alaska we had a sort of a UBI and it reduced hospital visits or whatever, or lost work days, fine, but it doesn't matter if in this world we're going to be trading off the security of the UBI for something else. And so if I am the con, I'm asking in response to every major pro source, did that source look to UBI replacing, or was it UBI just stacked on top of stuff? And in most of these cases it was the latter. So the pro's going to have a real problem pointing to these things against good con teams because they're going to say that's totally irrelevant. It's not a trade-off, it's just a gift, right?
Yeah, and what's important to recognize on the con is you don't have to be against the UBI. You just have to be against replacing welfare benefits with the UBI.
So,
I mean, in IPDA, I would probably run, yes, we need a UBI, but we also need to have welfare benefits for those who need it most.
100%. I mean, 100%. The con, as we're going to talk about later, the con's philosophy is 100%. It can be 100%. We don't have a problem with a UBI. We have a problem with replacing stuff, right? That absolutely is a viable con strategy. So anyway, that's a lot of framework to get through. Thanks for your patience on it. Now we will get to the part that you've all been waiting for, which is arguments on the pro. And thankfully, even though there are some problems with them, there are a lot of them. So let's get to that right now. Okay, so on the pro, there's a lot to cover, so we're going to have to go pretty quickly. I think one essential thing that every pro probably has to argue is that means-tested welfare programs in the status quo leave a lot of folks behind. This is a critical way of trying to mitigate the harms that we see from getting rid of these programs by basically saying these programs aren't all you think they are. They don't take care of everybody. Even if we get rid of benefits, even if some people lose benefits that are really good, there are other people who aren't being taken care of at all, right? And a UBI would at least take care of everyone equally. Everybody would get it. And I think this is super important to, in addition to sort of talking about the ability to spend more money, it's super important to try to mitigate that. So for example, there's a really good example of this. Scott Santens in TechCrunch in 2016 has a really good article that talks about how means-tested welfare programs leave a lot of folks behind. So he talks about how less than a quarter of those eligible for TANF benefits for needy families get them. And in some states, it's actually far less. Right? So the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities talks about how in some states like Louisiana, here in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama, it's lower than 10% because remember, under TANF, we let states decide how to spend this money, and in many of these cases, these states are using it to like shore up other programs that they should be paying for, and the money is not making it to people who need it, right? So you see many states where fewer than 10% of needy families get it, right? Going back to the Santens article, we find that he says that only 24% of those eligible for federal Section 8 housing vouchers are getting housing. He talks about how 22% of U.S. adults have a disability, but only 4.6% get disability benefits. I think that one may be a little bit misleading because not all disabilities render you unable to work, but you get the basic idea. And he does this sort of basic calculus, and he says that even if the one person who was doing really well under the status quo, or at least getting a lot of benefits under the status quo, is hurt, the 3 out of 4 who were getting nothing are going to be better off under a UBI. I really, really think that this is important as a tool to kind of push back on the difficult math that the pro has. I will say some of Santens's numbers seem a little magical to me. I really don't know, for example, where he gets the idea of a $12,000 UBI, but this general principle does come from his article's pretty good. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities is another good article where you can talk about how little TANF money actually makes it to people who need it. That is a good way to start punching back and to say that spreading a little something across everybody is better than a few people get a lot and others get nothing, right? So since means-tested welfare programs have become such easy targets, right, there is an argument that a UBI might be a way to mitigate the risk, right? A way to prevent politicians from using them as an easy target and to maybe make them more secure in the long run, right? So, and that is exactly what's going on right now. CBS News in December of 2019 says that Trump's SNAP cuts could reduce or eliminate nutrition assistance for up to 5.3 million families. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in 2018 talks about how policymakers are currently looking at TANF as a model for reforming other programs like SNAP and like Medicaid to use block grants and give states more discretion. For example, Casey in 2018 argues that a UBI would be a much harder political target, right? They say that narrowly targeted transfers are often stigmatized and have limited political constituencies to support and defend them. By contrast, broad-based transfers like Social Security and Medicare in the United States enjoy stable and broad-based popular support and experience less political volatility. If appropriately framed, the same might be true for a UBI, right? Another supplement to that would be a story in The Hill in September 2019 that shows that the popularity of UBIs is rising. The overall popularity is up to about 49%. That's a 6% increase over February 2019. And the argument is that in the long run, it's going to go up and up and up because right now, 72% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 34 support it. So over the long run, it will become more popular. And I think the sort of broader theoretical argument is once you actually put this money in people's pockets, right, they're not going to give it up. There's a saying about Social Security in this country, which is it's the third rail of American politics, which like if you, as a politician, if you touch it, you die, right? It's like the electrified rail on the subway, right? If you touch it, you die. And it's because these people expect to get Social Security payments when they retire. And once you get the UBI in place, it'll be much, much harder to target, much more difficult to say, well, it's only for poor people. I don't benefit from it. Those people are lazy. They're not doing what they need to do. So the argument would be it would go from being a vulnerable target that could go away at any point where the benefits would disappear or be reduced to something that is much more solid and can be defended over time if you're interested in protecting the least advantaged in society. I will say, unfortunately, I wish this weren't the case, but there is a very real but pernicious, I think, racial angle to the support or lack of support for means-tested welfare, and there's an argument that UBI might improve that.
Yeah, Annie Lowry in her book, Give People Money, How a UBI Would End Poverty, Revolutionize Work, and Remake the World, talks about the racist roots of welfare and basically the idea that because welfare programs are geared towards lower income people, it tends to attach stigmas to it and have an element of shame involved. Whereas with a UBI, there would be no shame because everybody would be getting the same benefit. But she goes further to point out that current welfare programs have a lot of barriers in place that make it really hard for everybody who needs coverage coverage to get covered. She talks about the idea that if you are someone who is disabled but can't go to the doctor to get certifying documents, you're not going to get disability. Or if you're someone who's homeless and doesn't have an address, doesn't have any knowledge of where to go to claim your benefit, obviously you won't be covered by the existing system. But a UBI covers anybody who is certified as being alive in the United States.
Yeah, so I'm talking about that unfortunate like racial and stereotyping angle. There's this really interesting article from Wetz and Willer in 2018 on how white racial bias leads to less support for welfare programs. And basically what it says is that when white people are shown reports in studies that they are less likely to be the majority in the United States, their support for welfare goes down. But when they're shown reports saying that white folks remain the majority in the United States, it doesn't go down. So there is a racist component to whether people are on board or not on board with continuing means-tested welfare. And the argument would be that a UBI would mitigate that. It would protect whatever benefits that we are paying because, again, there's broad-based support. And Ann Lowry, the person you talk about, actually said this in an interview with The Atlantic, which is that there is broad-based support for things like Social Security and Medicare that everybody gets. You hate the idea that racism would be a factor at all, but in a world where we have to acknowledge that it exists, we want to make sure we're protecting the least advantaged, and packaging it as a UBI rather than something that is fraught in these ways, I think arguably might be a way to do that, right? Another point, I think, in terms of benefits on the pro would be the idea that the UBI encourages innovation and risk-taking, which is crucial in an information-based economy. So there's an article from Scott Santens in 2016 in the online journal Medium that talks about how universal basic income will accelerate innovation by reducing our fear of failure. And this is just kind of a common sense point. In our information-based economy today, so much of our wealth comes from people who are willing to drop out of college or pursue an idea or a patent or an invention. Things like the Steve Jobses of the world, right? The Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, right? People who are willing to go out and bet everything they had on some idea, and it grew and it expanded. But what you might note is all three of the folks I just talked about were relatively well off, middle class to upper middle class, white folks, right? White guys, right? And the argument is that a UBI will unlock the potential of many, many more people who might be willing to go out and take a risk on the next killer app, on the next killer business, on an invention because their failure wouldn't leave them destitute. You'd have people from lower income backgrounds who traditionally haven't been included in these spheres, growing the economy by being willing to take more risks. A corollary of that, I think, is an important block that all pros need to have, which is on this idea of UBIs reducing work. A common theme from the con is going to be that if you just give people money, they're just going to sit around and they're not going to work. A 2018 University of Chicago study by Damon Jones looked at the Alaska Permanent Dividend Program and find that there is really no evidence that happens. There's no correlation between an increase in a UBI or creation of a UBI and reduction in employment rates, which is kind of common sense when you look at how low a UBI would be, right? When we're talking, even a $10,000 UBI is not going to be enough to live comfortably on. So the idea that people would just abandon work and abandon employment and things like that seems to be pretty far-fetched. Instead, what you're going to see is people going out and working in a way that maybe takes more risks and has a potentially greater upside for society, rather than just feeling like I've got to be locked into this job, at a restaurant or at a store or something like that to make ends meet. I've just got to stick with this because it's the only thing I can do. No, instead, I might go out and try to invent something or patent something or create a business, and if I fail, I've still got enough to have a basic subsistence, which in the long run arguably would lead to a more productive economy. At least that's the theory, right?
Yeah, and on that idea of productivity, we've looked at experiments with the negative income tax, which is kind of like a UBI in the sense that involves a cash transfer. What we see in those pilot cases is that when people leave the workforce, they're doing so for reasons of either getting higher education, furthering an idea like Brett said, like having an entrepreneurial kind of idea, right, or doing something that's also societally beneficial, like getting involved in care work, that is like caring for their children or caring for their family members. But what we see is it's almost always beneficial. Another point that was raised by Stanford economist Raj Chetty talks about the idea that people will leave jobs that they don't like and spend more time unemployed, but to do a more thorough job search. And what that's been found is it increases economic efficiency because you have a better match with the job. Whereas if you do the quickest first job you find, it's not necessarily going to be the best match.
Yeah, a corollary of that is it also gives you great, in theory at least, if we forget for a second the part where we take away the welfare benefits, if we just look at the UBI, it in theory does give you a stronger hand in negotiating for a better salary, right? If you are an employee and you desperately have to keep the job to eat, right? Well, you're not going to have the part of negotiating. You know, one of the few things I agree with Donald Trump on is one of the things he said in The Art of the Deal is if you want to be a good negotiator, you have to be ready to walk away from the table, right? Well, if you desperately need a job to eat, right, and you have no other alternatives, it is very hard for you to say, I want a raise and I'm not going to stick around if you don't give me one. But if you have this basic supplemental income, it gives you greater leverage to say to your employer, you know what, I don't necessarily have to be employed every single day of my life. I'm going to go look for something else. And it gives you a stronger hand in negotiating to allow you to potentially raise your salary. So while there's no hard evidence on this, there is at least a logical, theoretical, economic argument that what a UBI could do is for people who are working, it could allow them to do a better job of maximizing their value and getting what they're worth out of their employer, right? Now, changing gears a little bit from the purely economic, there's also, and I think you do need to do this if you can, the UBI, also has a potential to benefit people in more intangible ways in terms of like the quality of their life and the meaning of their life. The way I have this tagged is the UBI benefits mental health and or provides a more meaningful existence, right? And there's a really good article that we're going to link to from Clemens Witt, I think that's how you say it, from DOC Research Institute in 2019, and he just sort of surveys some of the mental and physical health benefits that you see from like UBI style programs. And he gives lots of fantastic examples from Canada, from the Smoky Mountains, North Carolina, Malawi, places like that, of how UBI and, to be fair, guaranteed minimum income type programs, but they are similar, had beneficial effects on the mental and physical health of folks. For example, in Canada, they resulted in fewer work-related injuries, fewer trips to emergency rooms. In the Appalachia, North Carolina example, we saw reduction in behavioral disorders by 26.7% among Native American youth. We saw less drug and alcohol consumption. In the Malawi example, cash transfer payments allegedly resulted in 38% less likelihood of schoolgirls suffering like psychological distress, right? And this idea that having a certain degree of control over your life results in just living a better life is kind of a good way to turn the debate away from the purely numerical and the purely economic. Now, again, you have to win that we're not going to be stripping away more benefits than we provide, but if you do, there's a really good article from, for example, from Kira Newman of Berkeley in 2016 that talks about why this is. A universal basic income gives people a sense of control, and she says there is considerable psychological research to suggest that a sense of autonomy and control is a basic human need, and it results in higher well-being, more creativity, more productivity, and less burnout, right? On a related note, there's a study from Hugel and Franklin in 2017 that talks about how a UBI would help remove the stigma of benefits, right? And the stigma and the feeling that I am getting something I don't deserve, I am at the bottom end of the society because I get a means-tested welfare program, that is a significant psychological harm and cost in and of itself. So there's a lot of good evidence out there that suggests if you want to take a turn and have maybe a third contention that says people deserve to have a meaningful life, right? You shouldn't have to be a wage slave churning away every day, over at the Burger King or churning away in the basement or in the mailroom. You should be able to maybe instead take a part-time job, spend your time painting, hiking. That's what it means to be alive, right? I mean, that gets a little bit esoteric, but I think it's worth saying the point of life is not to grind away working to maximize economic productivity. It's to do things you enjoy. And if it gives someone the chance to work a part-time job like 20 hours a week and then go paint or hike or meet other people, that is the point of living, right? And I don't mean to be too over the top about it, but I think it's an argument that's worth making, right?
Yeah, and building on that idea of a part-time job, and we've all heard the argument that a UBI will be inevitable because we're going to automate away our jobs. And you'll find studies ranging from everyone loses their job to a few people lose their job, but like regardless of what piece of evidence that you read there, The consensus is if we don't lose our jobs, at the very least our job hours are going to be reduced and our tasks are going to be reduced. So one argument like Brett's making is I work a part-time job because I lost part of my job to automation, and I spend the rest of my life being productive in other ways or just living a meaningful life, and the way to do that is with the UBI, not welfare.
And I think one last point that needs to be made on the PRO is the idea that in the long run, depending on what the time frame is for the resolution, right, you could argue that a UBI sort of becomes inevitable, right? And the argument for this, and there are several sources and we'll drop them, but I'm just going to make the common sense argument, is that the more we depend on automation and robots and algorithms and things like that to do jobs that human beings previously did, right, the less need there is going to be for human labor, right? Throughout the entire history of our species, the fundamental assumption of our economy has been that the average person would be able to sell their labor to meet their basic needs, right? And as we have machines that are more like humans in their ability to understand things and to do things and to manipulate objects and manipulate information, there's going to be less of a need for human labor. Now, this is not a 100% slam dunk argument. There are arguments on both sides about how, well, automation and AIs are going to lead to more different forms of employment. But I think, overall, if you look at what the sources say, and we'll present sources on both of them, the more you have, tools that are able to think like a person, it's really impossible to conceive that over the long term you won't have less labor. Like, I'm a lawyer, right? And there are algorithms now that are capable of doing significant work that lawyers have done, like writing basic motions. And so instead of a lawyer having to spend 5 hours writing a motion, you can have an algorithm write it and a lawyer spend 30 minutes checking it. And if that's happening to attorneys, right, it's certainly going to happen to people in more physically oriented professions, right?
And there's a couple things you need to emphasize here. One, you don't need to look at overall jobs in the economy, because if Brett lost his job as a lawyer, he can't immediately go and be someone who programs robots.
It's displacement, right?
Yeah, there's the idea of displacement. But the second idea is that automation isn't necessarily going to completely destroy jobs. It's just going to reduce your task and potentially make jobs that were once full-time, part-time jobs. So what we see here is a UBI would allow you to have a part-time job because that's all that's necessary, and then you spend the rest of your time doing something else. Or if you're in a profession where you're being displaced for whatever reason, a UBI would give you time to retrain for another job. And that'll be important even just in the context of climate change, because we know that fossil fuel professions obviously are going to become obsolete if we do what we're supposed to for climate change.
Right, so that idea of being displaced from your job temporarily, that's kind of the short run argument. We're already seeing that happen. A UBI would definitely help when people are displaced from their jobs, certainly. But in the long run, I think there is actually a decent argument that a larger portion of humanity is not going to be able to economically sell their labor for anything close to a living wage, because robots and AIs are going to be able to do it. And that's where that's where a UBI really comes into fruition as something that's necessary. So in the interest of brevity, we will wrap up the pro and move on to the much more precise con side of the debate.
All right, so we're going to move into the con, and honestly, your biggest slam dunk argument on the con is the idea that a UBI transitions funds from the poor to relatively affluent households.
Yes.
What we see is that right now, according to the Brookings Institution, 80% of federal benefits go to the lowest two income quintiles, or the bottom 40% of incomes. But if you have a UBI, naturally that money is going to be split equally among everybody, so it's going to be going to people in those upper three income quintiles. Just to put numbers on it, the Brookings Institute looks at Andrew Yang's proposal, and they find that 40% of the money goes to people earning more than $77,000 per year, which clearly is not an impoverished wage, and that the same amount of money goes to the people who are actually impoverished.
And look, I think this goes to a very basic concept that the con can point to, which is this. We don't necessarily have a problem with a UBI. Now, you don't have to concede that. You can also argue the UBI is bad. But a viable con strategy is just to say we don't really necessarily oppose the UBI part. We oppose the replace means-tested welfare part, right? UBIs, in theory, stacked on top of this might be good. They might not. I mean, you can certainly run both. But the real problem is trying to replace this program that is these programs that are targeted narrowly and specifically to the poor with something that we are going to shotgun across the entire population as a whole. If any of you have ever done a little bit of Lincoln-Douglas debate, you may be familiar with John Rawls. He says that we need to look through a veil of ignorance and try to determine what is best for the least advantaged in society. Whether, you're not going to cite Rawls and PF probably, but your case is very much going to take on an angle that meeting our obligations to the least advantaged is more important than any sort of aggregate economic benefit. If we're letting disabled people and needy children and single mothers suffer and potentially die, right, it doesn't really matter if we are in the aggregate slightly growing the economy, although we're going to say that we're not. So for example, on that point, just to Alicia's point, there's a good article from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in June 2019, and it has a good quote summarizing this. If you take the dollars targeted on people in the bottom fifth of the population and convert them to universal payments all the way up the income scale, you are redistributing income upward. You're taking from the poor and giving to the rich. I added that part, but then it says you would increase poverty and inequality rather than reducing them, right? And there is really good information in that article about how these means-tested programs like Medicaid, Head Start, Child Assistance, and others have been absolutely essential in doing things like wiping out child malnutrition in the Mississippi Delta and in Appalachia and reducing the poverty across the country. And it sort of leads you to ask the question, exactly how much of a loss to the poor are we going to see? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2018 noted that 21.8% of U.S. families receive some form of means-tested welfare, right? And right now, whatever the number we spend, like we said earlier, it's about $1 trillion, somewhere in that neighborhood. Well, all trillion or whatever of that is going to that 21.8%. When we do a UBI and we do the replace version of a UBI, we're going to take that and we're going to distribute it across the whole population. So now 21.8% of our poor are going to get 21.8%, and the other almost 80% is going somewhere else. It's going to upper middle class families like mine. It's going to very wealthy people, much richer people like the Mark Zuckerberg type folks in the world. And the question is, why in the world would we ever do that, right?
Yeah, and the part that makes this even worse is the idea that people are going to waste that money or just not use it. So this comes from Haynes and Mogstad in 2015, and what they did is they looked at universal programs like universal childcare, and what they found is these were almost exclusively used by low-income people rather than upper and middle-class families who want something better for themselves. What this translates to in a UBI world is that if you're low income, you'll use your UBI and spend it, and you'll be stimulus for the economy.
You'll go to the grocery store and you'll spend all of it. And when you spend all of it, that's going to be a great economic stimulus. It's going to help the grocery store hire more people. It's going to grow the local economy because it's going to be circulating right back into it.
But if you're upper and middle class, you're probably going to go put it in your savings account, or maybe if you're feeling savvy, you might invest it. But there's a whole lot of things that can trickle out from that. I mean, you could have stock buybacks and all sorts of economically damaging effects because you don't need to spend the money immediately, so you're just sitting on it.
Right, so that is sort of the utilitarian argument, but just coming back really quickly to this sort of purely moral argument, it's going to be this. You're going to say, why in the world would we take any portion of the money that we are targeting toward the poor, much less like 80% of it, right, the bulk of it, and take it from them and give it to wealthy people? And then the pro will say, well, it's not all going to wealthy people. Some of it's going to middle class people and working class people, but some of it, a non-trivial amount, like 1% of it, is going to the 1%, right? People making $1 million a year or somewhere in that neighborhood. Why did they need to get it? And I don't mean to be too sort of, play too many games here, but if the pro were to concede that anybody doesn't get this money, like Zuckerberg doesn't need it, we don't need to take $10,000 away from poor people to give it to Zuckerberg or give it to Bezos. As soon as they concede that there is any level at which you are too rich to need to get this, they are not advocating a universal basic income because it's no longer universal, and they are in fact advocating a means-tested welfare program because if you place any limit upon it, so one kind of gut level argument that I think the con can make throughout this is to look at the judge and say, if at any point you think someone is too rich to have $10,000 or whatever taken away from the poor, because that's what we're doing, we're taking it away from the poor. If you think there is any line line that we can cross where these people should stop getting this money, then you believe in a means-tested welfare program. It may not be the same means-tested welfare program we have today, but even a line that says just billionaires don't get it, it's still a means-tested welfare program. That's a little bit creative and a little bit sharp, but frankly, I think it's a winnable argument, you know?
Yeah, and I think at this point we really need to contextualize just how much money we're talking about. So let's just say the UBI is a yearly value of $10,000, which is kind of on the low end of some of the proposals, and it's on the high end of what we can actually afford. But for $10,000 for every person per year, that's $3 trillion in benefits, which is 3/4 of our current federal annual budget. So forget having a military, forget having public education, forget research for climate change. Where's it coming from?
I will add to that. I think I'm going to go and pull some slides from the old budget deficit video we did last year, because when you look at like real world proposals for raising taxes and raising revenue, even if you look at like the most aggressive progressive, ideas on how we're going to raise taxes, they only end up increasing revenue by something on the order of like $400, maybe $500 billion a year. This is talking about at least a couple $1 trillion a year. We're talking about increasing our total tax revenue by, 66% to 100% in a world where we're already $1 trillion a year on a deficit that we're spending that we don't have. And the argument would be, number one, there's literally no way to, even if the pro wins the idea that they are allowed under the rules, right, allowed under theory to spend more than the amount we spend, then they have to fight the fact that, number one, there's no practical way to do it. There is no real world proposal in which this happens, right, that we spend this much money. And number two, if we did, you could make arguments about how the impact on the economy would be absolutely catastrophic. So just so many hills.
And the argument you could throw on top of that is none of the UBI proposals, like any of them, even the most ambitious, actually give you a living wage. I mean, we hear a lot about how the minimum wage isn't high enough right now. You can't live on it in any state, even one as sad as Mississippi. Like, we see that if you work full-time, federal minimum wage, you make $15,000 per year. I mean, the best UBI I've seen is $13,000, and that one is rife with problems. But there's no way that we can raise enough money to do a minimum wage or a minimum universal basic income that will actually sustain people. And if we get rid of disability, I mean, there are some people who absolutely cannot work. They cannot get supplemental income, so it's got to be enough to sustain a person.
Right, because the pro is going to say, well, it's not meant to be the full wage, it's meant to be something that you sit on top of, but the response is there are millions of people in the United States today, I mean, we just said earlier, 4.6 million, I think, on disability alone, who are not capable of working. If somehow you decided you were also going to work Social Security in there, which I don't think you can, but if you did, it would be retirees, it would be elderly people who are no longer able to work. So at the moment you do that, right, you say we're going to replace your benefits with this universal basic income. Well, it's not going to be a basic income for these folks, right? In addition to that, I think there's an even stronger argument about what UBI cannot replace beyond just disabled folks, and that's health insurance, right? Remember, over half or around half, maybe more than half of our expenditures on means-tested welfare programs go to one thing, and that's health insurance. Programs like Medicaid, mainly Medicaid, which is health coverage for low-income Americans, right? All right, so when we make this change and we have this let's just say we have a $4,000 UBI because we take the $1 trillion and we divide it up and it gives us the $4,000 UBI. Well, is that going to enable, are people going to be able to get medical coverage? Because Medicaid's going to be gone. And not just Medicaid, but subsidies for buying your own health insurance are going to be gone.
CHIP will be gone.
Child health insurance, it's all going to be gone. So are people going to be able to have just Medicare medical coverage alone? And the answer is no. Because when we look to the Kaiser Family Foundation in 2019, the average price for an unsubsidized premium on a single person's health insurance plan was $7,188, and a family was $20,576. So right off the bat, if we're doing these $4,000 UBIs, you're done, right? You can't even get health insurance, much less anything else, right? You have no medical coverage at all. Medical coverage goes away. But even if we're doing a generous UBI, like somehow we get to $10,000, you're still eating up 70% of that on health coverage alone. And if you have a family with two breadwinners, like two parents, right, you eat up the whole thing because it's $20,000 $20,576. That's the first problem, which is that you can't afford health coverage. But even worse than that, and the title I have on this is UBI is no substitute for health insurance, is health insurance is designed to cover catastrophic costs. There's a reason why we don't currently just give people cash to pay for their medical problems, because they vary, right? You want to have medical insurance in case you get into an accident or have cancer or have heart disease and you run up, or have a rare illness and you run up $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in medical bills in a year, right? You can't pay for that with a UBI. The point of medical insurance generally, and Medicaid specifically, is that you are protected from those catastrophic costs. When we get rid of Medicaid and we replace it with a UBI, that's going to mean that every low-income person in this country is one serious illness away from total bankruptcy and being in debt to the hospital for the rest of their life, right? And that's bad, right? So for what that's worth.
I figure you want to talk about rent.
Oh yeah, well you can go, I'll do rent. Okay, so you want me to do rent next and then you do your stuff?
Yeah, you do rent and then I'll wrap it up.
Rent, so 525,000, sorry,
600 minutes.
One more quick thing. Alicia's got a lot of good information, but I want to get one more thing out before we move on to that, which is, this is a little bit of a squirrely argument, but I think it's worth making, is the idea that giving cash payments to low-income folks can lead to exploitation, specifically by having it recaptured through inflated rents and other costs. This comes from Jeff Andrews in 2019, and he points out that in the aggregate, a UBI would have the potential to put an upward pressure on rents, right? And the basic reason for this is, a UBI would be highly publicized. You would know how much everybody gets because it's the same, right? And as soon as an unscrupulous landlord realized that all of his tenants were getting $400, $500, whatever, $1,000, whatever dollars a month, well, the first thing they're going to do is realize, these people don't have a lot of options in terms of where to live. I'll just jack up the rent, right? I will recapture that money for myself. And so a big portion of the payment you're making wouldn't go to the needy folks. It would go to landlords and maybe other people, for example, like payday lenders and things like that, who would just raise rates and that kind of stuff. And he argues that this would be disproportionately bad for the poor because they're going to have fewer options and they pay a much higher percentage of their income for rent already to begin with, right? This is not necessary. There are economic arguments against this, but I think it is something that could absolutely appeal to a lay judge potentially by saying, like, under the current system, under Section 8, right, we don't allow this. We don't allow landlords to come in and charge whatever they want. We have rent controls because we know they would raise the rent, and if they could do so. But under this program, we're going to get rid of all that. We're going to get rid of Section 8. We're just going to hand out cash, and these landlords are going to be 100% free to charge whatever exploitative rate they want to the poor, unlike they are in the status quo, and they're just going to claw back a bunch of this money. So that's just another potential specific problem. I think this is something that a lay judge living in a city might be like, yeah, I totally understand that on a gut level, maybe to have a change of pace from some of the hardcore deep theory economics that's going on.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is if your opponent comes in there with lots of economic theories and things like that, one of the things you can point them to is a conclusion that Hoynes and Rothstein had in 2019. And what they basically concluded is that there's so much disagreement about what a UBI is meant to do that we can't even really adequately research the topic. We have no idea what it's going to do to growth or employment, or what we want it even to do to growth or employment and things like that. So we really need to look at, what does this study say? What do we actually want to achieve? And kind of make your opponent pick one or the other.
May I just use that as an opportunity to reemphasize the question that the con can ask every time, which is that because this resolution locks us into a highly specific version of a UBI, every single pro statistic is going to be met with the question of, did that study involve trading off benefits? And if so, were they all means-tested welfare benefits? And the argument would be, if they're not, certainly if they don't involve any trade-off, if it's just a program where you stack things on top of others, that's not relevant here, because the whole point of this resolution is a very specific trade-off. And if your statistics that you're getting are just about giving people additional money in Appalachia or Alaska or Malawi or wherever, there's no trade-off there, at least not to the people involved. So you're not really getting any valuable data under that circumstance, and you can ignore it.
Yeah, from my understanding of the research, there's really only one good study on the affirmative side, and it comes from the Roosevelt Institute, and we've got a really good blog for that basically says the Roosevelt Institute study that talks about how the UBI being replacing welfare programs will make things infinitely better. Their first gross assumption is that there will be no reductions in workforce participation, which is categorically untrue. We've seen that from pilot studies. But second of all, they assume that households don't modify their economic behavior in response to a change in how much money they have. or in response to a change in their tax burden, which, I mean, use your common sense. Like, that doesn't make sense as an assumption. And just be ready also, like with the ultimate trump card, which is right here, University of Chicago Initiative on Global Markets asked economists what they think about this very proposal. Basically, do we get rid of welfare programs to have a UBI? Only 2%. 2% of top economists agreed with the statement that getting rid of welfare programs and replacing it with a UBI would be better. That wins the round.
Yeah, and I see that helps. I think that you're going to need things to kind of cut the Gordian knot and make it simple for the judge. And one of the devices I think you have as the con is, especially since you're going to be able to dismiss so many of Pro's sources because they don't involve a trade-off. At the end of the round, you're going to be able to say, look, Judge, there is so little evidence for you to make this decision on. It's so risky. You are potentially betting the lives and the livelihoods and the safety and the well-being of the poorest of the poor in the United States. You had better have some pretty reliable stuff before you do that. What do you have? Well, you have a handful of basically small pilot programs in outlying places around the world, and none of them involve trade-offs. So you have almost no data whatsoever. What do we have? We have a study of economists asked about how this UBI, exactly what we're talking about here, like a trade-off for a very high UBI. We're being generous. Like this study you're talking about has $13,000. We have a survey of these folks asking, do you think this is a good idea? 2% of them say yes. 98% do not agree with that statement. Judge, if we were talking about some, fun little topic like, antitrust law, and how it affects Mark Zuckerberg back in NSTA last year, maybe you'd take a risk. But you don't take a risk with the lives of poor people when we've got a bunch of irrelevant, anecdotal, tiny little studies versus an overwhelming consensus that this is too risky. If you're not 100% certain this is going to work, Judge, you err on the side of the con, right? I mean, that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So really the only thing left to talk about evidence-wise is having blocks. I mean, you know what the pro arguments are going to be. I mean, you've watched our video and you also know because you're writing your own pro cases. So the big things that I see that you need to have blocks for is one, the idea that robots will take our jobs imminently. And the source I have is from Wired, and it gives you 3 or 4 really good reasons about why robots will not take our jobs. The first of these is that usually if you're going to have job loss, you're going to see productivity going up. That way you don't need as many workers. But what we're seeing is that productivity is going down. We're also seeing that things like churn are going down. And churn is where you leave one job to go to another job, but that's not going down. And we also see that unemployment is at one of the lowest rates it's been in a long time. And actually many employers are complaining about labor shortages rather than surpluses. So if they tell you that robots are taking your jobs, you can call BS.
There are decent sources out there about that say, in addition to what Alicia already gave you, that definitely say that in the medium term at least, right, we're going to see more jobs and more prosperity, for workers from AIs. And the argument would be, even if like in the far future, like in the Star Trek Federation, 22nd, 23rd century world, maybe it changes. That's not a fair time frame for this debate, right? The time frame of this debate ought to be like at most over the next decade or so.
Yeah, and the one other block that you really need to have is Brett made a point on the pro side that means-tested welfare is something that's always being attacked politically. A universal basic income would be less controversial, it'd be more safe. The problem is, this comes from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. If you look over the past 20 years, it's actually been your universal programs who have suffered cuts, and your means-tested programs have been expanded. So we've seen large expansions of SNAP, Medicaid, Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Care Tax Credit, whereas things like unemployment and Social Security have both been cut.
Yeah, like what I would say is, if means-tested welfare is in such jeopardy of being destroyed, why, when you look at a graph of how much we spend on it, does it go like that? Right? Does it just go up and up and up? If it's in such great jeopardy, why is it constantly increasing? And even when like Reagan decided to reform it back in the 80s, it went like a little inflection and then it went right back up again if it's so unpopular. One last block I have is the argument that the pro might have, which is that the UBI is going to be more efficient, like you're going to reduce waste. You'll just give people money so you won't need this like expensive federal bureaucracy to decide who gets what, and therefore more of the money will make its way to the people who need it. The problem with that is when you look at how the money is actually spent, and this again is from Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, but it's through a guy named Mike Congsel of the Roosevelt Institute as well. They point out that all of these major means-tested welfare programs spend at least 90%, if not significantly more, of their funds directly on the recipients. In some cases, it's 99%. So the efficiency gains that you might get in theory would be at most 1 to 9%. And of course, you're going to have some bureaucracy to administer. I mean, even the IRS, exists to collect money, you're going to have some bureaucracy to send it out. So you're not going to be getting massive efficiency gains. You might get a little bit, but it's not going to be a huge change. So I think that's an important block to have. So anything else on the con?
I think with that we can move into our final thoughts, which will come to you in just a second. Okay, so we're going to have some final thoughts, and I'm going to mostly take the pro because I'm kind of energized by that challenge, and Brett's going to mostly handle the con.
Because I need the advantage here.
No, but the big thing on the affirmative, I mean, you were clearly at a disadvantage, and we've shown you all the ways why, and shown you a couple squirrely ways that you could maybe get some of your ground back. But the big thing here is you're going to need to rely on pathos. So what I would do is I would walk up and have like a really slow, emotional story about a lady who didn't have access to welfare or was kicked off of welfare for a time limit, or some kind of really sad story about how she's struggling because the welfare system is not fair and how a UBI would help her. This is something that can really draw a judge in because, I mean, they live in Mississippi or wherever you're from, and they've seen poverty. I mean, we all have. So that's something, first of all, is to really lay on the pathos on the affirmative. But second is if you're going to do something shady with the definitions, if you're going to be like me.
I might call it shady, but creative.
If you're going to do something unconventional with the
Right.
definitions and try to say Social Security is means tested, like I have given you sources to help you do. Or if you're going to do something with the time frame and be like, I don't have to do it in the next 5 years, it can be in 200 years. You need to be prepared to make that fight, make it really clear, make it really compelling.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. Whatever you do on the pro, you've got to push all in. I think that's exactly right. If you say we get to spend more, then you better be ready to have that theory fight about why that's topical. You know, the basic idea would be that, you know, we can replace something, you know, like we said, where you can replace the Highlander with the Ferrari. Even if the Ferrari costs more and you have to get more money, it's still replacing it. Have that ready to go.
And also, like Brett mentioned, you do need to have a little bit of an idea how we're going to pay for this, because if someone's smart and has watched our video, they're going to clap back that even with common proposals, you won't dredge up the money. I mean, you need to go back to the 1950s when the marginal tax rate was like 70% and be fully ready with economic growth in that time period to back it up.
In other words, look, I'll tell you, we would love, on every video, we try to get as close to 50% as we have. We do not like coming to you guys and saying we just don't think one side is very strong, but this was not drafted in the best possible way, and you just have to deal with that. And look, if you can, at least in preliminary rounds, if you can go 50-50 on your pro rounds, then you might be in good shape, you know, depending on how things go. So you just have to go, you know, you have to work hard and you have to cross your fingers and kind of hope for the best and really sell it to the judge on a sort of gut level as a speaker. On the con, your mission is much simpler. It's you do the math. You say, look, here's what replace means. Replace means we take the money from this and we put it in that. Here's how much the money is. Here's how many people there are. Here's the UBI. It's very low. It can't replace Medicaid. It can't replace disability. It can't lead to a living wage. It's going to lead to people being worse off, and it's going to, and worst of all, it's not even going to put that money towards something good. It for some people maybe, like working class folks, but a lot of it's going to go to something that's totally superfluous and pointless, which is giving a bunch of money to rich people. There's no reason to do that. And Judge, by the way, as soon as you believe there should be any cap whatsoever, you believe in means-tested welfare. The minute you accept the idea that there is any number beyond which we shouldn't go, even if it's just the 1%, right, we should take at least that money and give it back to the poor people who are getting shafted here. You believe in means-tested welfare. These are super simple messages. Stay on message, be precise, do the math. It's not hard. But at any rate, it's going to be an interesting topic. We'll be back for March. Hopefully March will be more balanced, I guess.
Yeah, it's already kind of looking like an interesting topic area, but before we finish up on the con side, my last piece of advice to you is do not blow their mind with statistics.
Oh, yeah.
Like in public forum, I would go in there and be ready to bulldoze somebody with numbers, but the problem is your opponent can't take down your numbers that quickly, so they'll get up and cross and just completely misrepresent. Your judge won't catch it. Everyone will be confused. It's better to pick one or two really solid statistics per contention and just stick with that. If you've got more than that, use them as rebuttal evidence, but do not put them in your case.
So you're going to get through this, and we're going to get through it too. We wish you the best of luck on our annual economics topic. As always, if you've got questions, pop them in the comments below. We love them. So we'll see you in a month, and with that, we will sign off, as we always do, by saying debate is for everybody. So remember to work hard, have fun, and hail state.